we are going to discuss is the concept of a weak entity. Okay, it's a matter of perception. जो weak entity का concept है. All of the entities that we have identified so far, because we were primarily interested in storing the data about those entities, all of them, they are strong entities, right? For example, if I am designing a database for this classroom to record this lecture delivery process, the entities would be student and teacher and subject. So because I am primarily interested in these entities, so all of these, they would be strong entities. But there can be an entity in which I am not directly interested. The client organization is not directly interested, but because of some reason, a secondary level interest is there. For example, while modeling the database for this classroom, for example, we also want to store students' siblings' data. For example, that is required, but that's not our primary focus. That is, for example, our secondary focus.
Priority based program.
Yes, number one, it's a priority based thing. Secondly, this sibling is not participating in any other relationship. Thirdly, its data is totally dependent on student's data. A sibling is being made part of this system because he or she is a sibling of a student, and student is a strong entity type. So all such entity types in which we are not directly interested, we can model them as weak entities. And in order to accommodate a weak entity in the database, no identifier is assigned to a weak entity. Okay? A weak entity is without its own identifier, which means a weak entity's instance cannot be directly identified. In order to identify a weak entity's instance, we need to go through a strong entity instance, right? Because there is no identifier assigned to a weak entity. Rather, there is a partial identifier, okay? But that partial identifier cannot independently, uniquely identify the instance of that entity. So, a weak entity is represented with the help of a two-lined rectangle, okay? A double-lined rectangle. It's a representation of a weak entity. And a relationship which is there between a strong and a weak entity, right? A relationship which is between a strong and a weak entity, that relationship is referred to as an identifying relationship. What is that? An identifying relationship. Why? Because the instance of a weak entity is identified with the help of that relationship, right? So that relationship is referred to as an identifying relationship. I believe that this concept is clear to everyone. It's a good way of communication, right? It's an excellent way of communication. And it is from Stone Age, right? So these are some of the symbols which are being used. Please be attentive. So these are some of the symbols which are used in the entity relationship diagram, okay? Here is an example.
Same color.
Associative entities, we have talked about associative entities, okay? Now another concept is attributes of relationships, okay? Please be attentive, it's a very important concept. Attributes of relationships. So far, we have seen attributes of entity type, okay? But a relationship can also have attributes. There are some cases in which the value of an attribute is not solely dependent on an entity type. Rather, the value is dependent on the relationship of more than one entity types. For example, there is a relationship between students and course. And what is that? The relationship is that a student is enrolled in a course. Now there are some of the attributes whose values are solely dependent on the entities. For example, if I ask you name of a student, you can give me an answer because that attribute is attribute of student, right? Similarly, if I ask you a subject's title or code, you can tell me the subject's code, right? Because that is dependent on solely on that entity. But there can be an attribute. For example, if I ask you what is the grade, okay, you'll ask me whose grade? I'll tell you Hammer's grade, right? Then you'll ask Hammer's grade, but in which subject, right? So both the entities have to be there. So the question is, the actual question is, the correct question is, what is Hammer's grade in database? Now both entities have to take part, right? So such type of relationship in both entities have to take part. That attribute is dependent on the relationship because one entity cannot determine the value for that attribute. Okay, so it is an example of an attribute which has to go to the relationship. Such type of attributes, they have to go to the relationship. Discuss some.